In the latest Union update, we received a number of details that have led to some very interesting revelations, such as the Master of Masters' relationship with Darkness and Brain's Keyblade, confirming his rather obvious connection to Ericus, and even some potential understandings about the Book of Prophecies. Now I have some thoughts on Brain and his Keyblade and what it means going forward, but for this video I'm going to focus mostly on the Master of Masters and his connection to Darkness. Now it's pretty clear that the Master of Masters has got some sort of relationship with Darkness, one that goes back as far as before the events of all the current Kingdom Hearts games. How far back is not known, but I have some thoughts on that as well that I'm going to get to. This entire update seems to be affirming the theory that the Master of Masters has some connection to the light. Now whether or not he's the personification of light remains to be seen, but it's quite clear that he is meant to be in opposition to the darkness, which is why he has previously said he wishes to defeat it, even if it takes lifetimes to do it, and even if it takes a lot of setup, even if he has to leave this world, end that world, discard time and cast away the borders of that world, he'll do all of that to defeat the darkness. Now to me that sounds like a lot of work to defeat an opponent if he was supposedly friends with it or working with it. No, he's clearly quite opposed to the darkness, but I don't think he wants a world purely of light either. Xehanort went down the path of darkness, and he was inspired by the words of the Master of Masters, who purposely set him on that dark road. Now we discover by the end of Kingdom Hearts 3 that Xehanort did all of this because he wanted to end the tyranny of light, not because he wanted a world of light or of darkness, but because he wanted to reset everything and start from a blank state. The Master of Masters seems to have a very similar objective, but instead he seems to be on the side of light. Or at the very least he has set up the chess pieces on the side of the light, and I believe he's done this because he knew darkness was already too powerful. Remember, in the Union update, Darkness says that there are more of it than light, and that's during Union. There are many Keyblade wielders all trying to gather and protect the light in Union, and yet Darkness is confident it still is in more number than light. The Master set up the foretellers to fight one another, and then he left, allowing his plan to play out whilst he takes a rest as an observer. I guess he spent a lot of time putting all the pieces in place, and then he retired for a time and just let everything run its course. Now this is likely due to the Keyblade War that occurred when the Master of Masters was a boy, as he mentioned in an update a number of months ago. He says that the war when he was a boy was between the light and darkness, and that it never actually ended, and that in fact the next war would likely be its ending, and it is that war which would end the world. And that's exactly what happened. The Keyblade War that happened in Chi is what ended the world, but of course we know that wasn't the final war because of Kingdom Hearts 3. But it seems to me that Darkness has always been in the stronger position throughout the entire series of Kingdom Hearts. It's always been a few steps ahead. All of the antagonists that sided with the Darkness always had a bit more on their side rather than the protagonists who had to train and strengthen themselves just so they could match the darkness. Xehanort was always prepared and several steps ahead. Even Ericus didn't see his betrayal coming. So darkness and those who side with it have always had the upper hand against those sided with the light. And because, like he said, that war never ended, darkness obviously had the upper hand all since back then. And so he's had to come up with a new strategy in order to counter the darkness, because clearly from the first war, when light and darkness went head to head, it didn't play out the way that he would have wanted. So this time he's like, alright, you know what, we're gonna have to take a new tactic, we're gonna have to do this a little smarter, and it may take lifetimes, but this time we're gonna do things a little differently. Now in regards to this past, possibly first Keyblade War, how long ago exactly could that have been? We don't know exactly how long ago that was. But what's interesting is that he seems to be the only person that knows that this war even happened. That seems to heavily imply that he is in some shape or form the only one around who knows about it. And that's interesting. That implies that there's no records of it, that there's no history of it, that there's nothing in the world that would let them know a Keyblade War existed before. I mean, where's the evidence of it? And is he the only person who survived from it? Darkness says that him and the Master are old friends, and Luciu even comments that the two of them sound similar in terms of how the Master described Darkness. So in that regard, it seems as though they're being set up to be in opposition to each other, two sides of the same coin, light and darkness. Now the Master has clearly studied Darkness, almost in a similar way to how one might study, I guess you could say, their enemy of war. And he seems to have quite a lot of knowledge from all of that studying. He must have known darkness before, and darkness confirms it, and well, the time before, as far as we know, was the Keyblade War. It seems to be implied that darkness was around in that war. So that means darkness might know about it, but that's it. Which means the Master of Masters being on the side of light and darkness being, well, darkness, are the only two survivors of that Keyblade War. And so they're the only two people who would know exactly when and why it happened. That leads to a number of questions and some possible implications that I think are quite interesting to consider. The Master of Masters specifically says that the war between the light and darkness never really ended. Now, I don't think the Keyblade War is what he means. The Keyblade War that happened when he was a boy obviously must have finished, because these Keyblade wielders that are in existence now are not at war. But he says that the war is still going. If it's not a war between Keyblade wielders that's going on right now, then it must be a different war, a war between light and darkness. And I think that's the war that never ended. That's the war that he wishes to end. But it's possible that the Master of Masters realized that even if the light does overcome the darkness, even if the light was to defeat it, that the light itself could also become a tyrannical force, and then darkness will just rise up again eventually to oppose it, meaning the cycle between light and darkness will continue. The never-ending struggle between the two would continue. The same struggle that he had to live through in his youth would continue. So to end that cycle once and for all, the world would have to be reset and a new order would have to be ushered in. And this is what Xehanort was trying to achieve. And remember, the Master of Masters knows everything that is going to occur, because the foretellers weren't fighting for darkness at all. In fact, they were all misguidedly trying to fight for what they thought was the right version of the light. And that ended the world. But it was in Kingdom Hearts 3 where it explicitly says that the darkness prevailed and the light expired. And that was where the Keyblade was formed to summon Kingdom Hearts. And it was through doing that that the world would be broken from the cycle of light versus darkness. And now we know the Master of Masters is in Unreality. That's a place where light and darkness do not exist. Now, I don't believe that the people on the other side have no concept of good and evil, or even a concept of light and darkness. I'm sure if you were to ask him, Yuzora would argue that his enemies are evil and of darkness. But I believe what it means is that Unreality doesn't have the actual powers of light and darkness present. For example, a being like darkness wouldn't naturally be able to exist there. And similarly, the powers of light and darkness that we've been using throughout the Kingdom Hearts series to fight and as magic, they couldn't exist either, meaning that in that reality, there is no primordial power of light or darkness that's trying to control the inhabitants of the world, throwing them into a constant conflict. Now, conflict may exist in that universe, but I don't think it's because of light and darkness. But then why is Sora there? And was Sora being in Unreality part of his plans? I'm not entirely sure. But the Master of Masters seems like he has a good understanding and handle on everything that's going to happen. So I'm going to assume it was. Because in the epilogue of Kingdom Hearts 3, Lushu summoned the Foretellers, and that seems to be part of what needs to come next for the Master's plan. Which heavily implies that Sora ending up on the other side was part of the Master's plan. But for what purpose isn't entirely clear. But that's an interesting thread of thought that I'm going to try and explore a bit more in my next video. But anyway, I'm going to leave it there. That's all I've got to say for this video. You guys share your thoughts below. What do you think is the significance of the Master of Masters relationship with darkness? I know there was quite a lot that I said in this video, but hopefully it all made sense and was put together in a way you could understand. And remember guys, I am still a small channel, so any support that you guys want to show is greatly appreciated. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more Kingdom Hearts theories or just similar thoughts on JRPGs in general, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you're notified when I drop new videos. But anyway, my name has been NextGenNovelist, and that's all I've got to say, and I'm out. Peace.